Hi, everybody. This is the review recording, or the second of review recording. Basically, I'm dictating a new one for exam two for our advanced phys examination. And so, without further ado, we're going to get started with regard to that. Two chapters, 50 questions, the usual culprits, multiple choice, true, false matching, that stuff. And the reality is that I've tried to limit it, you know, to take out some degree of the complexity that's associated with it. Okay, and I anticipate that the third exam just is typically immunology, and I tend to throw in a little. Uh, how shall I say it? I tend to throw in a little bit of blood vessel physiology, which is another one of the topics we're going to start to look at. Uh, that's there. So I mean, those are all things I'll be working on going forward. I think I'll probably do the blood vessels first before I do the immunology aspect. I'll do that after the break. But here I go with the review. Uh, what we start with endocrine. Endocrine. Ductless glands are the hallmark. They work directly through the bloodstream. They have a variety of targets that have to have receptors, either extracellular or intracellular. It doesn't matter. Okay. Uh, so really, when you talk about them being defined by, it's going through the bloodstream to receptors, whether multiple receptors for a particular hormone or just limited receptors, like the gonadal tissue, with follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. So by and large, they are a combination of either protein or peptide based substances for the most part, with one exception, and again, that's the remarkable thyroid hormone because of its symmetry, becomes, rather than being water soluble like all the amino acid based ones, versus the fat soluble ones, which are all byproducts of cholesterol. And again, the one remarkable exception is the tyrosine base with those two sort of flip flopped or, you know, one in one direction, one in the other direction, symmetrical molecule we call thyroid hormone with the addition of either three or four iodines. So that's the interesting part about that. So the steroidal ones, with the exception of, again, of that one, and the steroidal ones are not. So thyroid hormone, even though it's fat soluble, is not by definition a steroidal hormone. And the steroid of choice for us is certainly cholesterol. So, and cholesterol is effectively metabolically tinkered with whatever gland it's being produced from rather, and modified into something that by definition is fat soluble or lipid soluble. Okay. And so, how do we look at these things? The water soluble ones have to work on receptors on the cell membrane. They work extracellularly. They are incompatible with moving through the membrane. They're too large, or there are no passageways that are available. And effectively, they utilize second messengers. So, the hormone is the first messenger, and whatever the second messenger is, be it calcium, be it cyclic AMP, be it cyclic GMP, doesn't matter. Whatever those are, it's going to that's its mechanism, that very, very famous, and we've gone over it 63 times, that G protein passageway and second messenger system, all that crap that's in there. The lipid soluble ones work on, they are able to cross through the membrane. They target intracellular receptors within the cytoplasm. They form a complex that's still membrane compatible and is able to traverse the nuclear membrane and effect changes in transcription and translation. That's how they work. So easy enough to remember all of those types of things that are there. That's the basis of the endocrine system that are there. There are three different factors that play a particularly interesting role in controlling hormonal releases by way of the endocrine system. They can work through humoral, which means within the bloodstream. So, classically, the parathyroid hormone, or for that matter, glucose. Effectively, as levels rise and fall, they either impact, let's say, parathyroid hormone when calcium falls to basically become active, or if there's an intake of glucose, then we're going to see insulin levels rise, etc. So that's we call humoral, which means in the bloodstream. Hormone to hormone, you can think of the arc of that I described, from like the hypothalamus to the posterior to the anterior pituitary. So GnRH, gonadotropin release hormone, is going to induce other hormones to be released by the pituitary. That's hormonal control. Neural control means means an override, effectively, and fight or flight surely is the classic example of this, to induce basically the endocrine system by various ways to produce certain hormones. And certainly the big player in this directly would be even though the adrenal medulla is not technically uh, a quote unquote endocrine gland, it acts like one because it releases hormones. So effectively, it causes fight or flight, and then we begin to see a substantial release of hormones by various other organs, including endocrine organs. So that so when a hormone works directly, like say the vagus directly on the heart, it's not really okay impacting the endocrine system. It's affecting an organ itself, even though it's by definition, you know, appears to be an interaction. I mean, I think of acetylcholine as being just a neurotransmitter rather than specifically being a hormone. Okay, so all of those types of things are significant. I believe that's there. So again, when we're talking about nervous stimulation affecting the endocrine system, I think fight or flight by far and away is the best. Let's look at the complexity of the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary has direct neurotransmitters that effectively are hormones like oxytocin and oxytocin, or genetically made pitocin, or vasopressin, known as antidiuretic hormone. Those are two, so we would call them ADH and oxytocin. For instance, they have also the other hormones are those RHs and IHs, the release hormones and inhibitory hormones. They're still, by definition, hormones. They travel by the bloodstream, even though it's a short trip, to the anterior pituitary and cause changes to occur. We should know the specific effects of those. Now, the RH and the IH, gonadotropin release hormone, thyroid release hormone, the ones that uptick and downtick, inhibitory hormone, and releasing hormones, are all pretty self explanatory. What's interesting is the specific effects. For instance, oxytocin obviously stimulates the birth canal and rhythmic contractures and utilizes positive feedback to produce a vaginal birth, and it also plays a role in lactation. Whereas antidiuretic hormone, very, very specific in what it does. Okay, it inserts protein passageways, typically in the collecting ducts or the distal convoluted tubules in the urinary tract, and effectively they pull water back in. This one does not impact the sodium. That's when we get to aldosterone. That's there. So you have to understand the way that those types of things work. So effectively, what it's doing is decreasing the amount of water that's in the urine. It's helping antidiuretic. It's pulling water back into the system. Ignore the dog. He's busy. Like I said, we're watching soccer, but his game doesn't start until later. So again, know all the different hormones. So there's the big, what I always call the big six that come out of the anterior pituitary: human growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. You have to know the acronyms: HGH, ACTH, okay, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, and then prolactin, the oddball, so to speak, FSH and LH, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. Got to know all those. So when we look at the range, it really is the number of cells, not so much the distance, I would say, but the number of cells. So I mean, pick something that is, some of them are very specific. Adrenocorticotropic, the adrenal glands, follicles, gonadal tissue, testes and ovaries. Okay. HGH, tremendously wide range. When we look at something like insulin, a tremendously wide range. That's there. Nearly all cells are impacted by it. Okay. Now, when we start talking about the different specific aspects of those hormones, what do they do? estrogen and testosterone and progesterone. That's luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone affects the production of the other quote unquote reproductive hormones in the ovaries and the testes. Where follicle stimulating hormone, when we talk about follicle, that's eggs and sperm. So you have to know the distinction between those two. That's important. Indirectly, certainly, GnRH impacts those, but it's indirect because it affects both FSH and LH that are there. Uh, we certainly in this, we spend a lot of times looking at disorders of it. And so classically, think of the ones we've discussed so far. Antidiuretic hormone, that's called diabetes insipidus or salt diabetes. And effectively, if you're unable to have a sufficient amount of antidiuretic hormone, and we can make it genetically and supplement that now, people are continuously thirsty. They urinate, but the urine bears a large amount of sodium that's in there because of the mechanism that's involved in that. So diabetes insipidus or salt diabetes, where diabetes mellitus, or quote unquote sugar diabetes in the old days, basically indicates that we're not only is there an abundance of urine, but there's abundance of glucose in the urine. So, I mean, there's been so many different varying names that have been associated with these conditions over the years, sort of colloquially. But remember, with diabetes, so when you know, from an examination perspective, if the question refers to one of these conditions, look for either mellitus or insipidus. Okay. I mean, a lot of the questions that I phrase will say in diabetes, blank happens. And, the default, which you can certainly ask me, is diabetes mellitus. It involves sugar. And you can usually tell from the context of the question, but just go from that. For 1,000 times you've heard it. What's the single most important? These cofactors, which we call minerals. And when it comes to thyroid, it's iodine. Down, when you get further into, maybe you touched on it in biochem, where typically zinc plays a role in a lot of the proteins, those metalloproteins that are there. So we got that those trace elements play a role, but iodine is probably on the side of being a little less trace than you think because of the abundance of thyroid hormone that we utilize. And the interesting thing, when you look at the thyroid, obviously the formation of the goiter and the absence of the iodine, because effectively the thyroid stimulating hormone will cause the thyroid to produce an abundance of what's called globulin. That is the substance that eventually becomes thyroid hormone, but can only do so in the presence of iodine. In the absence of iodine, it just basically sets up that vicious cycle that leads to a goiter, famously, and why we have iodized salt and why we have it. You don't need a whole lot of iodine to avoid this, but typically we've accomplished this with a relatively small amount of iodized salt, and there's a ton of that. And anytime you see salt in the packaging of something you buy at the store, it's iodized salt. That limited amount of iodine allows the globulin to be made effectively into T3 and T4, even though by the time it gets into the tissue level, we want it to be T3, which is the active portion of it. The vicious cycle is without that release, the globulin accumulates, the thyroid swells. And what goes on because of that is there's a limited amount of T3 or T4, if any, in the bloodstream. So the thyroid stimulating hormone continuously is produced. Your hypothalamus just sees a lack of thyroid hormone. It doesn't understand the cause behind it, obviously, so to speak. And thyroid is remarkable because it effectively controls metabolic rate. Hyper and hypothyroid individuals are very, very well known. Hyperthyroid, increased metabolic rate, sweating, nervousness, a lot of production of things like stomach acid, uh, hyperactivity that's not quote unquote ADD or ADHD type of related. It's just think of their body's engine idle as being very high. Where hypothyroid, you end up with dry skin, not perspired skin. You end up with somebody who's sedentary. You end up with a lot of times with folks who are very unable to do a lot of activities, fatigue easily, all of those kinds of things. The thyroid, as long as it's normal, all your other systems function well. It impacts literally all of the other systems, whether it's reproductive, whether it's cardiovascular, whether it's kidney. Everything in the body has to go at a specific rate, and that's the role of thyroid hormone. We have the adrenal gland has 3 layers. Remember, the interior, going from outside to inside, or peripheral to central. The interior layer is the medulla, effectively the ganglion of the sympathetic nerve. And yes, it has glandular function and releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, although they're neurotransmitters. Their role is hormonal in the bloodstream. Fine. We're not really an endocrine unit. Our viewpoint is a lot more about the 3 layers, whose names you're not going to have to know. That glomerula, uh, I don't remember, fasciculata, reticulatus, glomerulosa, I believe. Don't have to know them. The outermost layer, that's where we see aldosterone, that vital chemical that plays such a pivotal role, and we must have it to retain sufficient sodium, to retain sufficient water. That whole renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism is based on that. And it's there. What does aldosterone do? Aldosterone, again, in the collecting ducts and kidney tubules, inserts protein passageways that attract sodium, and water follows the sodium, so we retain it. It pulls it out of the urine. So what does it do? It increases the amount of sodium retention by the kidney. And likewise, okay, it increases the amount of, because sodium and potassium typically go in opposite directions. We increase the amount of potassium leaving, okay, exiting by way of the urine. So that's an important issue as well. So that's the big player, because without aldosterone, we're not going to survive. Whereas in the middle layer, you have cortisol. Cortisol is not as clearly understood. It certainly plays a role in glucose metabolism. It's how we release our sugar supplies in times of stress by way of the liver, and glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So there's a lot of play that's in it. It tends to be notably anti-inflammatory in basis. Okay, so it's a potent anti-inflammatory, and for the longest time, because we've known about cortisol and been able to manufacture it for a very, very long time. Uh, Pharmacologically, it was the main player in dealing with autoimmune phenomena, which basically was using it. So we have, and again, when you look in pharmacology, you have 2 things: steroidal and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Steroidal ones are cortisone, whether it's a dose pack, whether it's Medrol, whether it's an injectable cortisone. There's a zillion of them. Whether it's topical and hydrocortisone, that's anti-inflammatory in nature. That's why we use it on poison ivy and rashes like that. And the non-steroidals, aspirin would be a poster child for that, but there's so many. Ibuprofen. At one point there were 8 different categories, all of which have their own subset of problems, I'm here to tell you. So that's important. The kidney itself is another important area. The kidney plays a pivotal role in the release of aldosterone. Okay. And it does so, again, we studied the mechanism, and we'll look at it again. We'll look at kidney physiology more so in the latter part of the term. That's that renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. So you need to be familiar with that. The renin is produced by the kidney. That's what's released at the kidney level, and what are called the juxtaglomerular cells. The other chemicals that are involved in that mechanism are produced in, for instance, angiotensin in its precursor form is made in the liver. It just happens to be within the bloodstream. So the same thing. Angiotensin converting enzyme, same thing. Those are made but not produced directly by the kidney. That's a critical area. And so the interesting thing about women as opposed to men is with regard to the endocrine system, and it also plays a role a little bit in the kidney. The other thing the kidney has that's hormonal that it makes is erythropoietin, which is a relatively potent stimulant for red blood cells, and why folks with kidney disease often are anemic in nature. And the reality is that people would have to have functioning kidneys, and that's where women produce most of their red blood cells. Men get a lot of it from testosterone. Women, very little, because the only testosterone-like substances are produced within that most internal, the third or the deepest layer of the adrenal cortex, my dog is going to give me a problem, and we're going to have to do something about it. Okay. Uh, the islet cells are where both insulin and glucagon are produced. They're different. There's alpha cells, which are glucagon, and beta cells, which are insulin. Glucagon and insulin work in concert. They're homeostasis 101. And so I'm going to come back after I think, and I'll start with glucagon because the dog is insisting on going out. Go figure.